Network.com to find more great thought-provoking and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the history of the papacy at a2zhistorypage.com. You can connect and like all the social media from there and link to Apple Podcasts where you can leave a rating and review. That would really be greatly appreciated, and I really appreciate all of your support. If Patreon isn't your thing, PayPal through the website a2zhistorypage.com is still an option, as well as patreon.com/papacy. A huge shout out today goes to our Rome level patrons, Peter the Great and Mary Carmen. I want to thank our Constantinople level patrons on patreon.com/papacy, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, Yoren, and Molly, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Francine and Richard. Today, as the title suggests, we are very excited to talk to Professor Bart Ehrman about the Bible and popular culture, and just a lot of wide-ranging topics. I think you're really going to enjoy it, so we're just going to dive right in. As always, I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Thank you for joining us today for this very special interview with one of the most acclaimed biblical scholars of our day, Professor Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is a religious studies professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the United States. He is the author or editor of over 30 books, including the soon-to-be-released book, The Triumph of Christianity, How a Forbidden Religion Swept the World. He is also the author of the book Lost Christianities, which I read from cover to cover several times over. We are going to have a wide-ranging conversation on the rise of Christianity, the Bible and Christianity in popular culture. Dr. Ehrman has appeared on the History Channel, BBC, Jon Stewart's show, I mean, you name it. It is, I'm just incredibly humbled to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Now, can you maybe give us a little bit about your background and your areas of academic interest?
You're right. You want my academic background. So I did my graduate work at Princeton Theological Seminary. Did both a Master's of Divinity and a PhD there. I went to Princeton because I was interested in studying the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. And the world expert in that topic was a man named Bruce Metzger, who taught at Princeton Theological Seminary. And so I had no other particular interest in going to Princeton Seminary other than this fellow taught there. And so I went there and did a master's thesis with him, and then did my PhD there. And the field I worked on was the study of the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, the technical field of textual criticism. While I was finishing my PhD there, I started teaching at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and was there for 4 years. And now I've been at University of North Carolina for 30 years. Yeah, so that's the rough academic background.
And so you got interested in the Bible through the Greek manuscripts. What drew you towards those?
Well, actually, I got interested in the Bible because of my personal religious commitments back when I was a mid-teenager. And I had a born-again experience in high school and decided I wanted to know more about the Bible. And so my initial college experience was actually at a fundamentalist Bible school, Moody Bible Institute. And it was there that I was very, very conservative evangelical Christian, and I believed at the time that the Bible's very words had been inspired by God in some way. And I got interested in Greek manuscripts because I knew that different manuscripts had different wording. And I was interested in knowing, how do we establish what the original wording is, given the fact that we have so many manuscripts with so many differences in them. And for me, the original interest in Greek manuscripts was because of my personal religious beliefs.
Do you think that the Bible as a literary document is something that's worthy of study for people who are maybe not even religious?
Well, absolutely. I myself am no longer religious. I moved away from my evangelical faith during my graduate school days, and eventually, about probably 18 or 20 years ago, I left Christianity altogether, and now consider myself to be an agnostic. But I still think that the Bible is the most fantastic book, and it's what I spend my life reading and writing and thinking and teaching about.
What do you think for somebody who's a complete novice? Where should they jump into the Bible?
I would say probably I would start in on one of the Gospels, maybe like the Gospel of Mark, which is the shortest of the Gospels, and it gives a succinct account of Jesus' life and death. And so if I had to pick one place to start, probably somewhere like that.
Let's talk a little bit about this new book of yours that's soon to be released, The Triumph of Christianity. This is a really fascinating subject because the premise of the book is that this really small cult in the Roman Empire becomes the religion of the empire in a very short amount of time. What made you get thinking about this subject?
Well, I've thought about it for a very long time, and for many years, I wanted to write this book, but I thought, the topic is so big. I mean, it deals with so many different things that I thought it would be really complicated, and it turns out it was. But I've tried to make it simple so anybody can follow along the plot. And what's driving the plot is the fact that Christianity, from a strictly historical point of view, Christianity has been the most important force in the history of Western civilization for the last 1,700 years. I think you can make that argument that not just religiously, but politically and socially and culturally, Christianity has had a massive influence on the history of the West. And my question is, how did that happen? If the New Testament is right, which in this case I think it has to be right, that immediately after Jesus' death there were something like 10 or 11 men who came to believe in his death and resurrection, and a handful of women, unnamed women, mostly unnamed, except for like Mary Magdalene. So suppose there are about 20 people. These are lower class, illiterate day laborers from a remote part of the Roman Empire. How is it that within 300 years there are 3 million Christians in the world, and then 100 years later there are 30 million Christians in the world? So my question in the book is, how do you get from 20 people like that to 30 million? And so, so I think it's a really interesting question. And historically, in terms of Western civilization, there aren't too many questions that could be more important.
You get into the beginning of the book that religion of the paganism, quote unquote paganism, it was a lot of different ideas that were mostly located in a place, that even Judaism was a religion of a place. Is that an accurate way to state what the religious situation of the Roman Empire was at that time?
Yeah, when people talk about the various religions of the Roman Empire, they group them all together and call them paganism. Paganism really refers to any religion that's not monotheistic, and so any of the polytheistic religions of antiquity. And one of the big questions I wrestle with in the book is whether it's fair to lump together the entire, 93% of the entire empire, and call it one thing, paganism, meaning not Jewish and not Christian. There's a wide variety of religions, and you're right. If you went to different places, you'd find different religions. At the same time, these various religions, hundreds of them, thousands of them throughout the empire, had some things in common. And so what I try to do in the book is to explain what it is these various pagan religions had in common, and what it is about these that made them both like and very much unlike what came about with the advent of Christianity.
Maybe you can explain just a few of the common threads that were with this 93% of paganism.
Yeah. Well, the one thing they all have in common is they believe in many gods, and so they're polytheistic. There were different gods in different places. Sometimes lots of different places shared gods. They had the same gods, and those would include, for example, the gods that we know about from Greek and Roman mythology. So that in Roman mythology, you have the king of the gods Jupiter and his wife Juno, and you have the god of war Mars and the goddess of love Venus. So you get those great gods, but then you also get gods over various cities, and you get gods that are of each family has its own gods. And you have gods who are over major areas. So you have every forest has a god, and every mountain has a god, and every river and stream has a god. And you have gods for all sorts of functions, for childbirth, and for the crops to grow, and for the weather, and for victory in war. And so there are thousands of gods everywhere. And so that, everybody agrees that in the ancient world, except for the pagans and except for the Christians and the Jews, everyone agrees that you have these many gods. And so that's sort of the first thing. The polytheism itself is distinctive. One other thing that's distinctive that makes these various religions different from what emerged with Christianity is that all of them believed that the way the gods were to be worshipped was not by believing the right things about them, thinking the right things about them, or behaving in the proper ways. So what we think of as doctrines and ethics were not really so much concern of these Roman religions. What they were really concerned about was performing the proper cultic acts in order to satisfy the gods. In other words, to do the practices that the gods anticipated, and the two main practices were making offerings to the gods, such as animal sacrifices, and saying prayers to the gods. And somebody who did that, who was religious and performed the proper offerings and said the proper prayers, could expect that God would provide for them and give them the things that they couldn't provide for themselves, whether it was health or the crops to grow, or for the rain to come, or for the girl next door to fall in love with you. Whatever it is you needed, the gods could provide.
The Judaism of the first century BCE is kind of the link between that paganism and the Christianity, because that Judaism of that time had some of the elements that you talked about. How did Christianity fit into the Judaism of the time? I mean, it was a sect of Judaism. Did Judaism lend some things to Christianity that they were able to use to become this major religious force?
Yeah, so when I said that 93% of the empire was pagan, the other 7% was Jewish, right before Christianity came about, and even after Christianity was around for a long time, there are a lot more Jews than Christians. And Jews, unlike pagans, thought that there's only one God to be worshipped. The thing about the Jews is they didn't really care whether pagans worshiped their God, but Jews insisted they were only going to worship their God, and they were going to follow the practices that had been handed down to them within their tradition. Jesus himself started off as a Jew. In fact, he was a Jew his entire life. He followed Jewish practices, and he worshipped the Jewish God, and he accepted the Jewish scriptures, and he became a teacher of those Jewish scriptures, and he taught his followers his interpretation of those scriptures. And so his followers were all Jewish to begin with. And Christianity, I would agree with you that it started out as a sect within Judaism. It was a kind of Judaism. Even after Jesus' death, when his disciples thought that he got raised from the dead, they didn't think that they were starting a new religion. They thought that they had the true interpretation of what Judaism really was all about, and it wasn't until sometime later that some Christians started thinking, in fact, that the former pagans could join the Christian movement as well without becoming Jews, and that's when Christianity then became its own thing.
And one of the key figures who was one of the people who linked that was Paul of Tarsus. Can you tell us a little bit about him and maybe what role he played in this situation?
Yeah, I would argue that he played a really key role in this particular way. I don't think that Paul invented Christianity or that he founded Christianity, as some people say, but I think he certainly was instrumental in making Christianity what it became. Paul Paul tells us, Paul has a number of writings within the New Testament, and so we can get Paul in his own words, which is very different from Jesus, because Jesus didn't write anything that we know about. But Paul did write, and so we can see what he has to say. And he tells us that he started out, when he first heard about Christians, he was dead set against the Christians and was a violent persecutor of the Christian church. But he apparently persecuted Christians for a year and a half, 2 years. But then he himself had a vision of the resurrected Jesus. He claimed he thought he saw Jesus alive, and that changed his view completely. And he came to think that Jesus had been raised from the dead, which made him think that he was the chosen one of God, which made him think that his death must have been important and not just an accident or a miscarriage of justice. And he came to think that Jesus' death is what God had decided to use in order to bring about salvation. And so Paul came to think that the death and resurrection was a fulfillment of what God had promised in the Jewish Bible, in the Hebrew Scriptures. But what Paul also came to realize is that following the Jewish Scriptures is not what makes somebody right with God, because even if somebody's a Jew and they follow the Jewish Scriptures and that would make them right with God, there'd be no reason for Christ to have died. But since Christ did die and he was raised from the dead, that must be what God had in mind all along. And Paul's conclusion was that this means that a person doesn't have to be Jewish in order to be right with God. They simply have to believe in Jesus. And so he started this entire idea that Gentiles could become followers of Jesus without also keeping the Jewish law, and that opened up the floodgates for non-Jews to join this religion.
Is it accurate to say that Paul's writings are the first contextualized that are closest to what Jesus's times would be?
Yeah, so in the New Testament, when you read the New Testament, you start off with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you might sort of assume that, well, those then are the first ones written, and that's not the case. Paul's writings are our earliest surviving writings. They don't occur first in the New Testament because the New Testament's not arranged chronologically. It made better sense to the people organizing the New Testament to start with the life of Jesus, and that's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the letters of Paul were actually written earlier, and so they are our earliest Christian writings of any kind. And he started writing his letters about 20 years after Jesus' death.
It's interesting to me. This is one of the most fascinating parts is how do scholars timestamp something like a Pauline letter?
Yeah, it's not easy. So it's a very technical area that people spend their whole entire lives trying to figure out the chronology of Paul's life in relationship to these letters. The short answer is the way it's done is there are places in Paul's letters where he'll say things like, 3 years later I did this, 17 years later I did that, and if you line them all up, and you have a pretty good idea when Jesus died, which is sometime around the year 30 of the Common Era. So it might have been 29 of the Common Era, it might have been 33, but it's right in there sometime. If you've got that in mind and you add up these years for Paul, then you can get kind of a rough chronology. And there are some of Paul's letters where he refers to earlier letters that we seem to have. And so you can arrange the letters in some kind of chronological sequence. And it all works out that Paul probably converted around the year, if Jesus died in the year 30, Paul converted around the year 33. And his death is traditionally put in the year 64. So he would have had about a 30-year ministry trying to convert Gentiles to become followers of Jesus.
I'd like to get back to Paul's letters, but maybe end run them just a little bit. We have some dating of the Gospels, and it's of when they were released. But would they have been published on such a date, or were they revised works that were being released over a span? Because, I mean, they didn't go to a publisher. Okay, this is when we're coming out with the book, like a book would be now.
Right.
How can we get a date on those?
Yeah, it's really hard, and there are a couple things that people take into account when trying to date the Gospels. The first thing to point out is the Gospels don't tell us when they were written, and they don't tell us who their authors are. So we call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because traditionally that's who was ascribed the authorship, but we really don't know who the authors were. We do know that they were originally written in Greek, even though Jesus' native language was Aramaic. The language of Palestine, Israel at the time, was Aramaic. These books are written by highly educated Greek-speaking Christians, and so they appear to be somewhat later from the time of Jesus. The way you date things, there are two kind of major things you look for. You look for whether there are any references to historical events in the text. If you can see an allusion to a historical event, then obviously the book was written after that event. The other thing you look for are other authors later that you can date who quote the book. And so if you get quotations of a book, then obviously the book was written before that. In the judgment of most scholars, the Gospels appear to refer to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. That happened in the year 70. And so it's usually thought that the Gospels are written around 70 or somewhat later. They appear to be quoted sometimes, in some cases, in second century authors around the year 120 or so. And so the rough window is between 70 and 120, and there are reasons for thinking that probably Mark was the first gospel written sometime around the year 70. Matthew and Luke appear to have used Mark for many of their stories, and they're usually dated to 80 or 85 of the Common Era, and then John is usually thought to be the last gospel written around 90 or 95.
Were these distributed as a finished piece? Do we have any record of rough drafts of them?
Right. This is the thing, as you're saying. I mean, it's not like you set a publication date of February 13th and say that's when I'm going to publish my gospel, because they didn't have the book industry that we have today. In the ancient world, what it meant to publish a book was that you would release it to somebody else to read and copy. That was considered publication. An author would often write a book or a treatise or an essay or even a letter and would circulate it among friends to get suggestions, and then based on suggestions would edit it and then would release it, would send it out to put into circulation among anybody who wanted to read it. And so when people talk about the Gospels being published, that's what they mean, is the point at which a book was actually released. For example, if Mark was the first gospel written around the year 70, what that would mean is that whoever this person was and whatever his name was, he compiled an account of Jesus' life, his sayings, his activities, his death, his resurrection, and based on other sources, probably oral sources and maybe even written sources, and that when he was satisfied with what he had written, he let it loose on his community, probably his Christian community, and they started reading it and talking about it and copying it, and so it was at that point that it would be considered published. One of the big issues with a couple of the Gospels is whether they were published in multiple editions. A lot of scholars think that the Gospel of John actually came out in two different editions, and some scholars think that Luke also came out in two different editions, where the author, maybe some years later, decided to change a few things here and there.
Those documents, the four Gospels, are written in a different style, going back to the letters, where Paul is actually writing a letter to a community. Many letters are attributed to Paul, but even within the Gospel where there's the New Testament where there's 13 Pauline letters, only about 7 of them are actually scholars can attribute to him, how do you separate what might not have actually been written by him by what you can be pretty certain he did write?
Yeah, this has been a long-standing issue in scholarship especially since the 19th century. The deal is, as you say, there are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul, which is significant because there are 27 books in the New Testament, so we're talking about nearly half the New Testament books. What scholars started noticing in the 19th century is that some of these letters seem to stand at odds with the others. Their writing style appears to be different. They use a different set of vocabulary. Some of the theology seems to be different. And as they studied it, they came to think that there are 6 of these letters that may not have been written by Paul. There are 7 letters that cohere fairly well together in terms of writing style and theology and outlook, and these other 6 not so well. And so scholars talk about the 7 undisputed Pauline letters, and then the other 6, which are usually grouped into 2 groups. One is the pastoral epistles, which is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which are thought to have had the same author, but it probably wasn't Paul, even though it's a person claiming to be Paul. And then the 3 other letters are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians. They each apparently have a different author, but again, it appears to be each one of those persons was somebody claiming to be Paul, even though he wasn't.
I've heard in some circles, and I don't know if this is apologetics or not, that it wasn't necessarily they are forgeries, but they were kind of forgeries with the best of intentions, that they were writing like how they thought Paul would write. Is that just apologetics, or was that a style of the day?
Well, it's a bit of apologetics. So I wrote a book about this, actually. I wrote 2 books about this. One is a popular book for a general audience. It's just called Forged, and the subtitle is why the authors of the Bible are not who we think they are. And the other book is a very long academic book called Forgery and Counter-Forgery. And what I argue in both of those books is that it's wrong to say, as a lot of people do say, that nobody looked down on the practice of forging, of writing a book claiming to be someone else. It's not true that nobody looked down on that. If you actually look at if you look at ancient records, when people talk about this phenomenon of people claiming to be someone knowing that they're someone else, they always condemn it. It's viewed very negatively and condemned widely in our sources. Christian sources, Jewish sources, Greek sources, Roman sources, they all condemn this practice. On the other hand, a lot of people who were doing this practice in early Christianity, they may well have had good intentions, even though they would have been called liars by other people. They may have thought, well, Paul's not here, and if he were here, this is what he would have said. And so the thing is that they don't think anybody's going to listen to them, because who are they? And so what they do is they write a letter claiming to be Paul, knowing that they're not Paul, as a way of getting people to read their account of what Paul would have said. And so the ancient people who talk about this practice would have called it duplicitous and lying. But sometimes people think that the ends justify the means. And there's certainly a tradition in early Christianity that said it's okay to lie in some circumstances. And these authors may have felt that way.
Were these letters, was the basic content of them in line with Paul? I kind of think of the author from the 2000s and earlier, Michael Crichton, where he seems to come out, even though he died about a dozen years ago, a new book by him comes out just about every 2 years. Were they basically using Paul's notes, or were they coming up with just fresh material in these letters?
Well, one of the reasons we're thinking Paul didn't write these books is because there are places where they very seriously depart from what Paul had to say. Not just that they're different, but they're actually contradictory to what Paul had to say. And so I think what people don't realize is that there were a lot of people writing in Paul's name, and only 6 of these books got into the New Testament. But there were people who took opposite points of view who wrote in Paul's name, claiming to be representing Paul. And so it's not that these people in the New Testament got Paul right and everybody else got Paul wrong. It's that the theology that developed in early Christianity found some writings to be more compatible with this later theology than other writings. And so everybody, it's the sort of thing where everybody's doing it and everybody's accusing the other person of doing it when they're doing it themselves.
So we've established that Paul was a potent force in early Christianity. What was moving Christianity forward through the 100s and the 200s and the 300s in this movement towards becoming a dominant religion in the Roman Empire? Was it fait accompli at that time, or were there some things happening along the way?
It wasn't at all a fait accompli. And you might think if you go from 20 people to 3 million people in 300 years, you've got to have some mass conversions going on. There need to be like these Billy Graham rallies where thousands of people come forward. I mean, how else is it going to happen? What I argue in my book is that it doesn't have to be that way. There was a sociologist of religion some years ago who wrote a book about this topic. Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. Stark is not a historian of ancient Christianity or of the ancient world, and his book actually didn't get received very well by biblical scholars or by scholars of early Christianity because there are a lot of problems with it. But the one thing about him is that he's a sociologist, and nobody can crunch numbers better than a sociologist. And so what he knows how to figure population growth. And so what he did is he did something that nobody had ever tried before, which is he crunched the numbers. And he asked, how do you get from a small number early on to 5 or 6 million 300 years later? And what he shows is that you don't need to have massive conversions, and you don't need to have a miracle. All you really need is steady growth. And in his book, he argues that what you need is for the Christian church to grow at a rate of 40% every decade. In other words, if this year you've got 100 Christians, in 10 years from now you need 140 Christians, which means basically you need to convert 3 or 4 people a year. The 100 of you need to convert 3 or 4 a year. So what I do in my book is I show why his Stark's numbers are problematic in a lot of ways, but I show why the basic idea is right, and I tweak the numbers and I come up with, they're fairly comparable numbers actually, because it's absolutely right that what happens is you can, if there are 100 of you and you convert, say 3 or 4 people this year. If it's 1,000 of you, then that 3 or 4 people is 30 or 40 people this year. If it's 10,000, then it's 300 or 400 of you a year, and you just keep going up like that. When you got 1 million people, and if you're converting, say 3%, well, okay, yeah. So 3% of 1 million is 30,000 people in 1 year. So then, at the same rate of growth, you're converting 30 or 40,000 people every year, and you do. So it's an exponential curve. And so what I show in this book is that early on, Christians are a very, very, very tiny little minority that nobody's ever heard of, and that's true even by the year 100. We sometimes think that Christianity 100 is starting to make a big impact on the Roman Empire. If you actually crunch the numbers, they're probably less than 1/60th of 1% of the empire at that point. And so most people have never even heard of them. But you keep going at that rate of growth, and when you get to about the year 300, you're up to 3 million people. And so it's a highly significant number.
I read the Stark book too, and one of his ideas was that during some of the plagues, Christians were more apt to take care of their own, so they were actually able to, survive. They were able to raise their survival rate a couple of ticks over the pagan population. Do you think that that's one of the problematic areas, or do you think there is something to that?
No, I think it's highly problematic, and I talk about it in the book. So Stark does say this, and his evidence that Christians took care of the sick and that pagans did not is that that's what the early Christians said. In other words, Christians said, those pagans, they just let their family members die. We, on the other hand, nurse ours, and so, we're far superior ethically to those pagans. And the thing is, most historians don't take sources that brag about themselves at face value. You usually have to kind of look to see whether there's actually evidence of it. So apart from the fact that he uncritically treats the sources is a problem that the sources themselves point out that he neglects to mention, which is this. If the Christians were taking care of their sick more than pagans were, that means they were around infected people more often than pagans were, which means they would be infected more often than pagans were. And so the Christian sources that actually talk about this lament the fact that Christians take care of their sick and then they get sick and die, and that everybody's dying among these Christians because they're taking care of one another more. So it doesn't look like this would actually increase the number of Christians. It looks like it would decrease the number.
Well, I'm going to stop myself now because I could talk about these topics all day long, and we still you got to go read this book, and there will be links to where we can find your new book in the show notes. Depending on when you listen to this show, the book may have been released, but definitely go onto your preferred book place and order this book. Now, I thought we might switch gears just a little bit because almost everybody who's into the Bible has noticed that there's a lot of movies out there on the Bible and a lot of popular media, and some of it's pretty good and some of it's pretty bad. Do you have some popular media Bible material that you think is maybe better than others?
Right. So I'm not a huge expert on the Bible and popular media, but I actually do teach a course at UNC where I teach a course for first-year students that I'm teaching this semester that's called Jesus in Scholarship and Film. And so this class is interested in how Jesus is portrayed. How is he portrayed in ancient Gospels, both the four that made it into the New Testament and other Gospels that did not make it into the New Testament? And how is he portrayed by modern scholars who utilize our ancient sources to try and reconstruct what Jesus was really like? And how is he portrayed in modern film? And it's a really interesting course because students, among other things, they read a bunch of Gospels, but they also see a bunch of films, and they have to evaluate these films and figure out how is Jesus being portrayed here, and what's the point, and is it what's the quality, and everything else. So, one of the things I do early on that I'm going to be doing, I think next week for this class is. This will be their first time seeing any film because we've been studying ancient texts for the first month or so. In class, I show them a number of clips of the birth narratives of Jesus, where Jesus is born. And the way I prepare my students for this is I have them read the two accounts of Jesus' birth in the New Testament. There's only two accounts of Jesus' birth. One is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2, and the other is in the Gospel of Luke, chapters 1 and 2. I have my students read these accounts carefully, and then I have them list everything that happens in Matthew, chapters 1 and 2, and then list everything that happens in Luke, chapters 1 and 2, and then I have them compare their lists, and to figure out if there are any discrepancies, and if so, whether any of these discrepancies can be, if any of these discrepancies are irreconcilable. Students are amazed because everybody hears the Christmas story every year in December, and the Christmas story everybody hears is taking stories from Matthew and taking stories from Luke and smashing them together. But the problem is there are some differences between there are a lot of differences because they tell different stories, but there's some things that if Matthew's right in what he says, Luke can't be right in what he says. And so they do this comparison. But then what I do is I show them film clips and ask them, how does a director resolve these contradictions? And so we watch the silent Ben-Hur, which is done back in the 1920s that most people don't know about. The Ben-Hur begins with the birth narrative of Jesus. Then we watched the 1950s Ben-Hur, the one that's famous because of Charlton Heston, and it has a birth narrative. Then we watched The Greatest Story Ever Told from the 60s, and Zeffirelli's Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, and then we end with the life of Brian and the birth narrative of Brian. So at every point they're having to try and figure out, how is the director mainly following Matthew? Is he mainly following Luke? Is he smashing them together somehow? If he does, what's he do about the contradictions? So anyway, so that's my class that's going on right now.
Oh, that sounds like a fascinating class. Do you have one that's maybe a personal favorite?
I do. I absolutely do. It's one that none of my students has heard of and most people haven't heard of. And I guess it's because it's not actually an attempt to film the life of Jesus with Jesus as the main role. The film is Jesus of Montreal. Don't know if you've heard of this.
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it.
Fantastic. Best Jesus movie ever made by a long margin. It's an account of a Canadian acting troupe that is hired to put on a passion play at the local Catholic cathedral. And they come up with this amazingly funky, interesting account of Jesus' last hours. And they get in trouble for it because it's not orthodox. But the way the film works is the lives of the characters begin to reflect the account of Jesus' passion. And so it's a play within a play kind of thing. It is brilliantly done. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, that does sound really good. Do you think does a movie stick out to you that just really mangles the story in a really bad way?
Just about all of them do. They're terrible. I mean, I simply can't bring myself to watch King of Kings, the '60s version. I think what they all do is they have to. I mean, the only one that doesn't mangle things, I think, is Pasolini's Gospel According to St. Matthew, which just follows Matthew and puts a very definite spin on it, but it is a faithful reproduction of Matthew in many ways. In terms of films that I like, I think probably all in all, I like Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth the best, which was one of the very, very early miniseries on TV, which has absolutely the best Jesus on film, who's Robert Powell, British actor, who has these blue eyes that'll look right through you. Fantastic.
If you could plug into a movie producer and have a biblical-based movie made exactly to your qualifications, what would you like to see made?
Well, I'm just surprised that no one has ever made a movie that portrays Jesus the way that the majority of scholars have argued Jesus was like the majority of scholars over the last 100 years. Since Albert Schweitzer wrote his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, probably the vast majority of scholars in North America and Europe have maintained that in some sense Jesus is best understood as an apocalypticist whose major emphasis was that the end of the age was coming soon, that God was soon going to intervene in this world to destroy the forces of evil and set up a good kingdom on earth, and that Jesus' disciples were going to be alive to see this cataclysmic end of history. That's what Schweitzer argued. That's what the majority of people have thought ever since. But there's no movie that portrays Jesus as being a rigorously apocalyptic prophet. And I think it'd be fascinating because it's not what people expect, but it's the one that's probably historically accurate. I think they should do that one.
One thing that I've always wondered is there's not a lot of Jesus's childhood and teenage years. If I'm not mistaken, aren't most of the accounts he's born and then he's 33 and beginning his ministry? Is there even very much about what happens in between in any of the canonical sources?
There's only one story. So you have his birth, and then you're right. In Matthew and Luke, where you have his birth, it flips right to his baptism when he's older, an adult. And in Mark and Luke, there's no birth; he just shows up as an adult. There's only one story. It's in the Gospel of Luke. It's that famous story of when he was a 12-year-old in the temple, talking to the Jewish legal scholars, and so we're completely in the dark about his life before he shows up to be baptized. There are some Gospels not in the New Testament, though, that do take up this theme, and they're fascinating. The favorite one is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which portrays Jesus as a 5-year-old. Starts off with it tells stories of him from the ages of 5 to 12, and it's one of the reasons it's fascinating is because Jesus, as a 5-year-old, has all the powers that would be his as the Son of God. So he has all the supernatural power, but he's just a 5-year-old, and so he doesn't have any maturity. And so he uses his powers to do things that you wouldn't expect Jesus to be doing. But he's just a kid, and so when his playmates get on his nerves, he just withers them on the spot. Or when his teachers get upset with him and smack him upside the head, he zaps them, and so with a word. But then he ends up kind of getting a hold of his power and using his power for the good, and so it's a terrific little book that's, of course, didn't have much of a chance of making it into the New Testament.
What is the scholarly thought on why those years get cut out or why they're not reported?
I think the early Christians were really just interested in the miraculous life and death and resurrection of Jesus, and the tradition was that he was an unknown person who came from a small town, Nazareth, tiny little hamlet. Who was not well known, but then started engaging in miracles and doing his teaching after he got baptized. And so they just weren't interested in his childhood. They were, so they didn't have the kind of biographical interest that people have today. They didn't think that, he had formative influences or that he had experiences that shaped his later life. They just thought that, he shows up as an adult and can do these miracles and deliver these teachings. And they just really wanted to know about his miracles, his teachings, and his death and resurrection.
So watching that development, the character development, just wasn't something that was what people were interested in reading about?
Well, it's because people in the ancient world didn't know there was such a thing as character development. When you read ancient biographies of other people, such as biographies that you find in Plutarch, for example, the events discussed about a person's childhood are not meant to show that these are formative influences. They're meant to show that the person's character was manifest already as a child. So the ancient people thought a person's personality characteristics were already set at birth, and early events in their life could demonstrate those. So there wasn't an idea of a formative period or psychological influences or anything like that. That's all pretty much post-Freudian ideas.
If people want to follow you or learn more about you, where can they go?
Well, there are two things. I have a webpage, bartdehrman.com, which has my curriculum vitae and stuff like that on it, my speaking schedule and everything. But in some ways, a more interesting site is my blog. So I have a blog. Just somebody can just search for the Bart Ehrman blog, EHRMAN, the Bart Ehrman blog. I post 5 or 6 times a week, 1,000 words a day. I've been doing this for 5.5 years. Every week, 5 or 6 posts, 1,000 words each time, and it deals with everything dealing with early Christianity, from the historical Jesus to the writings of Paul to the persecutions of early Christianity to the role of women in the church to the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to how we got the Bible, just anything having to do with anything related to this. The only catch with this is that to belong to the blog, a person has to pay. The charge is $24.95 for a year's membership, but I don't keep a penny. I use this as a way of raising money for charity, and so I give every dime away to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. So last year we raised $120,000, and I'm trying to do better this year. But if people are interested in the kinds of things I talk about, this would be absolutely the place to go.
Well, that's just wonderful, and we will post to that in the show notes. I want to thank you so much for coming on. I could talk about these things all night, but I value your time, and there's more than enough material that people can find in your books and on your website and blog. So just thank you so much for coming on and talking to us today.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.